Phase 2 of the pandemic starts now, with the economy reopening after nearly 2 months of closure. Even so, it is not business as usual, with Americans still worried about the threat coronavirus poses to all of us. In such an environment, small businesses need to figure out what they can do for their customers in order to survive. One solution, many are already doing this, is to expand and pivot into the digital space. Joining us now, Angie Hicks, co-founder of Angie's List, the customer review site dedicated to helping Americans hire reliable contractors for home repairs. And Jordan Sweetum, Senior Vice President at eBay North America, the ultimate site for connecting buyers and sellers online. Jordan, Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff says small businesses must have a plan for a protracted slowdown. What do brick and mortar businesses need to know when they dive into the digital space, maybe for the first time?
Yeah, look, the number one thing for small businesses who are making the move online is to have a passion for what they're selling. What do they know? How can they make the most money? When I look at the trait that allows the hundreds of thousands of eBay small businesses to be most successful, the number one thing is, do they know their product? Do they know their customer? That passion will really allow them to adapt and come online and know how to work through this rapidly changing environment.
Angie, in a world of social distancing, what does customer service look like?
Well, I think it's time for you to rethink who you are and what you are. And I think Jordan made a great point about what is special about your company and let that shine. So if it was how you greeted people in person, think about how you might greet them digitally. Make sure that same personality comes across so that your brand still exudes exactly who you are and that same excitement for what you sell.
I want to go to some viewer questions, and our first is from a freelance designer in Houston. Take a look.
Hi, my name is Terrence Gilbert with Trademark Creative, and my question would be, with COVID going on right now and the fact that so many of us have had to transition our small businesses to virtual communication, primarily when we're used to meeting with clients one-on-one, what's the best way to provide as much clear communication and great customer service in the virtual age?
Jordan?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. In many ways, actually, what leads to great customer experience right now isn't that different from before all this unfolded. Customers want to be heard. They want honesty. They want transparency. If I'm shopping online and someone sort of lets me know, hey, I've got record sales, I'm maybe 1 to 3 days late, just setting that expectation makes such a world of difference. Whether as a customer or when I'm talking to customers, I've found that people probably now more than ever are really connecting on a human level, and they're okay that things are unknown. Telling someone, hey, I don't know what I can get this, but just setting that expectation is so important. I mean, in the context of Terrence's business, making sure to over communicate, ask questions, and making sure nothing gets left unsaid, I think is really critical. And like I said, I've seen overwhelmingly people are pretty understanding at this time.
Angie, our next question is for a business owner who's actually trying to build and hire. She's a Brooklyn-based skincare brand, Naked and Thriving, and she writes, I'm an entrepreneur ready to hire my first employee. What is the best way to hire and build a team when none of us are working in the same location?
I think when you're working with remote employees, the important thing is really thinking about how you're going to connect. Use the same kind of things that you would use when you were actually in the office. One of our teams the other day actually did a virtual scavenger hunt around their houses and competed as teams. So it was a nice break from the day-to-day. So when you're thinking about hiring someone, how are you going to get to know them? How are you going to interact? Make sure that you're interacting with them more often than you would in your office, because you want to make up for that time you would have just passed them in the hall or run over to their desk. So put time on the calendar. Use video conferencing if you can, because those are ways that you can connect as people, get to know each other, and really build a culture.
Do you worry, Jordan, that you lose that connection or you lose productivity with people all being in different locations? How do you solve for that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is actually what Angie just said around the culture. We say we're working from home, but we're not really working from home in the traditional sense. People are at home, but they've got kids. Their spouses are working from home. They're in the same space as their parents or their roommates. And so having sort of the, as a leader, as a manager, as hiring your first employee, having the empathy to connect with that new hire and understand what their questions are and their concerns are. I haven't seen productivity change on the output, but how it's happening is very different. People are collaborating differently. And so making sure that culture of communication and openness, I think, is really key for companies big and small to adapt through this.
All right, Angie, you're getting a really hard one. This comes from Andrea Lee. She owns a coffee cart business in San Antonio. And she asks, if you receive a loan from the government, where do you think is the best place to invest in your business right now? Marketing, labor, new products, technology, your own salary?
That's a great question, and one that's really, dependent on the particular situation. I think the first thing you want to do is, if you're getting the loan from the government, make sure you understand what you can spend that loan on. For example, the payroll protection plan is related to payroll, so you want to make sure you're using that on staffing-related costs. Then it's like, what do you think your business needs most as you're thinking about reopening? Is it that you need to create new products or create things inside your coffee shop to help you do more social distancing? That might be a good place to spend money. As you're starting to, get ready to ramp back up, I'm always, I always believe in thinking about marketing opportunities as well. You don't want to completely ignore those. So I think first, identify how you can use it. Second, then think about what's new and different that I need to do to be successful in this new world, and what do I need to spend money on to make it happen?
All right, I've got one final viewer question for both of you. Let's take a look.
Hi, my name is Enon. I recently started my own digital marketing agency based in Houston, Texas called Enoni Unseen. What advice do you have for growing a business when the cases of coronavirus starts going down?
Jordan?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I kind of tie it back to what I said earlier. If Enon's passion is this business, she will be successful. The trick to any entrepreneur and small business is flexibility, adaptability, agility. How is she able to sort of, talk to her customers and get insights and adapt? One of the things that I see works really well is connecting with peer groups of other people, other sellers, other consultants who are in a similar position, and ask for their advice on what are they doing in other parts of the country. How are they out there marketing through digital channels, through social channels, and their own personal networks to help drive up business? But again, for me, it comes back to that passion and enthusiasm and not being afraid to make some mistakes, as everybody is learning and iterating through this very dynamic business environment.
All right, Angie, I've got to give you the last word. From a great woman entrepreneur to an aspiring great woman entrepreneur, what do you think?
I think it's a time of perseverance. If you've got passion around what you're doing, you're going to figure out how to sell it. But you need to think about, how am I going to do it? Am I going to network differently? How am I going to respond to my customers? Now is the time to be very responsive to how your customers want to interact. So if they're wanting to, do video chat, or if they want to talk to you on the phone, or if they want to email back and forth, be really responsive, listen to them, and they will become incredibly loyal.
Angie, Jordan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time. I appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.